like this, man. It's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. Ain't nobody see it, nobody. Man, it seems like you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah, so we are continuing our deep dive into occultism. This is much further sort of a field than we've gone before. So you know what, Thomas? I figure let's just jump in. I'll kick it to you and we can go from there.
Yeah, thank you, buddy. Something that's been on my mind from the outset. I mean, this subject matter needs to be treated in a complete capacity, and I approach it anthropologically. You know, there's a political aspect to this, obviously, in that these sort of arcane forms and practices and ritualistic belief structures, these are deeply insinuated into human beings. You know, in the fossil record, but before humans became anatomically and behaviorally modern, there's evidence of things like human sacrifice, okay? And this endures until the present day outside of the civilized world. And this idea that somehow these practices just abruptly stopped when, you know, white Western people became Christian, or, you know, at some point in advanced societies, you know, whether the people in question are Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, when some level of technology or complexity or evolved morality is accomplished, these things just cease. That's not realistic. Okay, and the symbolic psychological power that these kinds of practices hold over the human mind and spirit, and the temptation towards these sort of evil practices and idolatrous interests, you know, there's no reason to believe that these things just suddenly abate, and there's every reason to believe that they endure. And something that I think can't be avoided, and this obviously is especially on my mind considering some of my own research interests, you know, and the people have been following particularly season 3 of the Mind Phaser pod. I've been dealing with, you know, Zionism and things in a direct capacity, and one of the enduring controversies with respect to, you know, relations between Jews and Christians of all sects is this idea of the Blood-Libel. You know, there's this enduring claim that emerged around the 12th century. My research indicates that it first emerged in Britain, which is interesting, in the 12th century. The claim is that Talmudic Judaism contains within it this primitive set of rituals and quite literally pagan belief modalities. And human sacrifice remains an aspect of that pastiche of arcane beliefs. And the Blood-Libel is a claim that on certain holy days, or, you know, in observance of certain high holidays, particularly Purim and Passover, that Jewish people have sacrificed Christian children and used their blood, which presumably has some animating or magical ritual properties, you know, in within these rituals, you know, either leavened it into bread or used it in various divinating rituals to appease evil gods. I say gods plural because that's significant here. There's the claim in part entails an allegation that Talmudic Judaism involves worship of literal demons, okay, or lesser deities. This is very pagan in the literal sense, okay? Now,
so several things, just as a brief interjection there. If people are interested, and this is one of those rabbit holes that you can devote your entire career to, but Jewish History, Jewish Religion by Israel Sawak, which is relatively easy to find. Friend of the show, Pete Quinones, has done a reading of it. It's a couple hours. This is accessible. That's a helpful source, sort of as a primer more than anything else. And two things is worth discussing just before we go into this, which is one, Judaism has a very different relationship with understanding and consent than most Christian denominations do. So for instance, in a Christian church, if hypothetically, your pastor was secretly a Satanist, right? And was doing things in such a way, if you were not, and this is kind of bizarre to think about, but hypothetically speaking, if you were, doing what he told you in good faith, you would be a Christian and not a Satanist, right? You were led astray per se, but your consent was not given to that alternative religion. Whereas in Judaism, consent does not matter. What matters is you are doing the ritual. You are going through the motion in a way more similar to Buddhism. And so what that means is that there's this, according to the author of this book and other sources, there is sort of this esoteric and exoteric religion. And when we talk about the Qabala, or we talk about Jewish mysticism, it is that sort of esoteric version of the religion. And so in cases like this, it's very difficult to say, well, who really knew, right? Who was aware of the fact that there are, in certain interpretations, other gods involved, especially when we look at, can be honest, really all Judaism before about 100 years ago, where Jews in Europe were incredibly tightly controlled by their rabbis. They did not know how to read. They were extremely discouraged from talking with anyone outside of their, immediate culture. And so the reason I bring this up is to say, this is a very, very different, very insular culture that has very limited connections to, the Bernsteins down the street, right?
Yeah,
the reason I say that is not to, kind of hand wring about our subject matter, but just to say, we're talking about a very, very bizarre, weird culture, and the analogies between religion as most moderns understand it and this faith sort of start to break down. Sorry, Thomas, just that previous out of the way, I'll throw it back to you.
That's well placed. Yeah, I was going to cite Israel Shahek in moving forward because he raised a point I think is interesting. And yeah, the understanding that there's this overemphasis on ritual in traditional Judaism that any Muslim or Christian would view as totally arcane and kind of senseless. But also, until very, very recently, basically all Jews were Orthodox, okay, in like de facto. I don't think people fully realize that. In the Pale Settlement, which really was the loci of Jewish life and kind of the concentration of, Ashkenazi culture. There weren't a bunch of reformed secular people walking around with this kind of like nominal ethnic identity. It was very, very tethered to what would be, we'd view as Orthodox practices. So yeah, all those points are well placed. And we're going to get into this in the second part, what I'm about to get into. But one of the reasons why this becomes so significant in terms of modern political and epochal events is just before the Russian Revolution, in 1911 thereabouts, this man named Menahem Beilis he was a Russian Jew. He was accused of ritual murder of a little boy who was a seminary student. And this was really like the sort of Leo Frank case of the late Russian Empire. It made international news. It was a huge deal, and the things that happened during the trial of Menahem Beilis were totally bizarre. Witnesses were dying. You had investigators recusing themselves. Beilis himself, he had bizarre connections to arcane religiosity. Like that was not in question. That was proven. Eventually, Beilis was acquitted due to the insufficient evidence. It was the trial was essentially organized into two phases. The first phase, in which the trier of fact was to determine whether the little boy was in fact ritually murdered. They determined he was. But the second phase was to determine the culpability of Menahem Beilis. They determined there was insufficient evidence to convict Beilis, which sort of cuts against this theory that, the Romanov dynasty was, Russia under the Romanovs was this savagely anti-Semitic country that was just beyond reason. If that was the case, Beilis would have been unceremoniously done away with. He probably wouldn't have even made it to trial. Okay, but I don't want to get into. I think
it's important.
What's that?
It's important to bring that up.
Yeah,
because there's sort of this like we was Kang's attitude towards the Russian Empire. You and I don't fall. We're not under that illusion, right? I think both you and I have a realistic view of the Russian Empire, but almost a lot of the criticism leveled at the Russian Empire is completely and totally unfair, particularly as regards the treatment of different minority groups, the relationship between Russians and Jews. Damn it. I'll edit that out. All right, there's a massive disaster happening outside. All right, cool. We're good. I'll just make sure to edit that out. The relationship between Russians and Jews is historically fraught. But the idea that, especially by the end of the empire, that it was like uniquely and particularly anti-Semitic is a baseless canard.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, by modern standards, was it anti-Semitic? I mean, technically, but again, by modern standards, what state is not? It's also, sort of this absurd waste of time.
Yeah, exactly. And the Russian Empire was a major world power, and it was a loci of high culture. There was terrible problems there, but yeah, it was an important country. And something I got into the other day with, Kevin McDonald, the degree to which Jewry views Russia as their prime adversary, that really can't be overstated. They absolutely hate Russia, and that's why it's incredible to me that people apparently don't understand this, and they don't grasp that that's what underlies the entire course of policy from 1993 onward, and this utterly irrational, zealous hatred for the Russian Federation. It completely defies reason, and this should be obvious what's animating this. But yeah, to bring it back, I want to take another episode succeeding this one and break down the trial of Beilis and deal with the evidence presented. And like I said, there really were bizarre intrigues on both sides. It was far very much a parallel to the Leo Frank case, but far stranger. Not just, obviously the poor Mary Fagan was a victim of what's unfortunately kind of a run-of-the-mill sex crime against a child. The trial of Beilis involved something far stranger, but that's kind of what that's kind of the point of taking on this subject, is people think this stuff is so strange and arcane that it's impossible to believe. anybody would, would in the late modernity would be engaging in this kind of activity. But just for a background, though, briefly, the murder of a 12-year-old Andrei Yashinsky. He was a student at this theological prep school, kind of like a seminary prep school in Kiev. On March 12th, 1911, he was murdered. And this touched off kind of a firestorm of hostility that had been, fomenting against the Ashkenazim, not without reason. To your point, there's real tensions there, and the Russian Jewry certainly wasn't doing themselves any favors in terms of how they were perceived and how they treated the majority culture. But there was this very strong vanguardist movement. They call themselves the Black Hundred, and they called themselves that. It was a throwback to, Florian Geyer in the Peasants' Revolt. He called his army the Black Company, and Peasant Revolt traditionally rode under a standard of black. That's why the Black Knight, he's not just a Ronin. There's a caste significance to that. Part of it has to do with if you'd fly a black flag, it had implications for your tax obligations to the landed elite who held dominion over you. But also it, was supposed to suggest a certain characteristic attending the rebellion underway. But the Black Hundred, they were very much committed to the Romanov dynasty. They were a pietist Orthodox movement, and they viewed the prime nationalities as Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, who they called the Little Russians. And, they were savagely opposed to the Ukrainian national movement. They'd fight with the Poles, they'd fight with, Ukrainian separatists. But interestingly, the communists became their primary adversary. Lenin himself, as early as 1905, singled out the Black Hundreds and said, "This is the vanguard of mass reaction, against the revolution. These people need to be dealt with." Okay, so the Beilis case took on it. Obviously there was an ethno-sectarian aspect that was incredibly divisive and polarizing, but also it took on a political characteristic that was absorbed into, but also reflective of the burgeoning paradigm that ultimately culminated in Red October. So that's really interesting. But to bring it back to sort of the wider context of Blood-Libel, again, this is something that had endured, this claim, or this accusation, for almost 1,000 years. Like I said, as far as my research indicates, that it was first emergent in the 12th century AD in what's now England, and subsequently spread to the continent. And as I said a moment ago, it's suggested that Judaism, Talmudic Judaism, demanded the blood of young Christians for myriad high holiday rituals and other things, and especially for the preparation of bread for Passover. In the Russian Empire, this was not really an enduring thing. It appeared much later than most of the continent. The accusation, I mean. People misunderstand, and Solzhenitsyn got into this, in his very good book about Jewish and Russian relations. The Russian Empire, it was only after the partition of what was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that took place really, I think, from the 1870s into the, towards the close of the 19th century. Prior to those partitions, there weren't very many Jews comparatively in the Russian Empire. But due to these successive partitions, annexations, Russia very rapidly acquired territories with comparatively massive Jewish populations, and ultimately becoming the country with the largest Jewish population in the world. And so this is another historical reality to your point. This idea that, the Eastern Slavs, and particularly the Russians, they're just constitutionally anti-Jewish, owing to this enduring history that's not really true. The idea that the Russians and the Ashkenazim have lived on top of each other for 1,000 years. I mean, it's the opposite. It's really only been a couple of centuries. Thus, the title of Solzhenitsyn's book, I think it translates as 200 years together. I've seen all other titles, but that's that's what he's referring to. And again, I don't want to get into the case of Beilis and the murder of Andrei Yashinsky, until the next episode. But just for context, some aspects of it should be raised now. It wasn't just that Yashinsky was found murdered. He was discovered in this cave. He was in a semi-seated position. His hands were bound behind his back. He was dressed in a shirt. He had his underwear and socks on. So, I mean, it wasn't, and there's no evidence of any kind of sexual molestation, but there was 47 puncture wounds around his body. The wounds to his head, specifically his left temple and his neck, had resulted in fatal blood loss. The blood loss was so profound, he was almost completely emptied out of blood. And the fatal wound that had facilitated the exsanguination, the proximate cause of death, what was his heart was punctured and they believe the murder weapon was an awl, AWL. It's some kind of curved, sharp blade. You can use it to puncture leather or wood.
Yeah, it's like it's not a needle. I mean, it's more probably close to like a chisel. It's, used for leather or canvas, right? It's basically a spike with a wooden handle you use to punch through, thick material so you can sew it.
Right.
Effectively an ice pick, right? For all intents and purposes.
So it's an odd murder weapon. Especially, not to be macabre and or take on a very sad subject matter, but it's not hard to murder a little kid, okay? So the reasoning was, this is the kind of thing you'd utilize if you wanted to bleed somebody. For example, stab them in the heart and then poke a hole in their, carotid artery and literally bleed them out. Okay. So it was very weird. Okay. And there were telltale signs of him being deliberately bled. All right. And again, I'm sorry to tease the subject matter and then move on, but to properly address the case, because Beilis was formally tried and he was acquitted, but there's a voluminous evidentiary record that needs to be dealt with. Like I said, this was a mobilizing catalyst for the Black Hundreds, and it had the effect too of dividing the state bureaucracy, which was pretty extensive during the Romanov era. I made the point before, the Tsar had his own secret police force. It's not like the NKVD or the Cheka. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that the Tsarist police element was anywhere near as, destructive or sinister. I mean, there's no comparison, obviously. And I mean, we're talking about two totally different things, and especially when you consider that the Cheka was very much an ethno-sectarian instrument of vengeance. But my point being, this elaborate state bureaucracy and this policing apparatus, it didn't just emerge one day, after the Bolshevik Revolution, but there was all manner of intrigues relating to the investigation of Beilis that suggested motives beyond mere corruption, which unfortunately was quite endemic in the late Russian Empire. But, again, this not unlike the murder of Charlie Kirk today, the murder of this poor little boy, Yashinsky, it was very much a catalyzing element. And you had the Black Hundreds who had substantial support within the Tsarist bureaucracy. Then you had revolutionary elements who had targeted them as their primary adversary because they considered them to be a counter-revolutionary vanguard. Then you had people who just, for whatever reason, had sympathy for Beilis. Often, it owed the business dealings that they had with, the Russian Jewish community, or, there was also people who had an abiding hostility, to the Romanov regime for various reasons. And, like many people who came to identify with Dreyfus and the Dreyfus affair, it just became this sort of symbolic catalyst, so this is the reason why I'm getting into this is because obviously the aforementioned were very much the victors in terms of the political struggle that was emergent, and subsequently any suggestion that, Jewish ritual murder could occur or was anything but this malicious lie and slander of an entire people, was just discounted outright. And don't get me wrong, I'm the first to admit it seems far-fetched that occultic practices, particularly literal human sacrifice, it seems far-fetched that this kind of thing could go on, in the modern era. But I mean, I don't know, the analogy I make or draw upon, or the comparative precedent I draw upon, the activities of people like Epstein and his mentors, and like Barr, that seems totally bizarre. And if you just said that to somebody absent, the Epstein scandal, if you just told somebody that 10 years ago, they'd look at you like you were a crazy person and say, well, you're just ascribing to these crazy ideas about what goes on behind closed doors. That's not real life. The idea that there's some billionaire pederast tied to the intelligence community whose sort of greatest passion in life is molesting kids and violating underage girls, and he has an island where he carries on these kinds of things, and he's got these kind of bizarre transhumanist cultic ideas. Like, people would say that was insane. Well, but apparently, I mean, it's a real thing. Okay. I mean, why this would be far-fetched, I think people should ask themselves that if they find this impossible to accept. But,
well, especially if you've been following along, if you somehow have made it this far and are still unconvinced, right? You're punching air on now the 7th or 8th episode of this series. But if you assume this is real, this atavistic tendency exists in men, well, surely it should appear in all groups of men. Obviously, there are different rates, different manifestations. Human populations are different. But fundamentally, the idea that, well, everyone else does it except for this one group, and then any accusation of, human sacrifice towards that group is, on its face illegitimate. It's unrealistic. It's completely and totally unrealistic. And this is especially difficult to talk about because I mentioned the sort of like we was Kang's attitude towards the Russian Empire that exists. One of the things that we were mentioning about before is that there is some sort of sloppy scholarship around this issue. One of the things you were mentioning before is, especially from kind of like the Russian, ultra-nationalist types who look, I don't necessarily have anything against them, but you do see sort of a lazy version of the thesis we're putting forth here. So just, again, sort of another kind of caution or proviso, but I'll throw it back to you, Thomas.
Yeah, no, that's well placed. Yeah, and I mean, the reason why in scripture, why it's so significant, the sparing of Isaac by, command of providence, because, the new covenant won't abide human sacrifice. The reason why that's so significant is because this is the norm. Okay, if you're talking about, symbolic, psychological aspects of human psychology, there's certain things that are just absolute taboos across all races and cultures, across, the most primitive, from the most primitive, sub-Saharan African tribe to the most advanced, kind of Western society. And I mean, things become taboos because not just because they're destructive or because they're bestial or because they subjugate reason to debased passions, but also they're things that have a tendency to emerge and then be impossible to control. Cannibalism's another one. One of the reasons I like that, it's a horrifying movie, but it's a great film. I like that movie, The Road, based on the Cormac McCarthy story, but the reason why the cannibals are so dangerous is because once you cross that threshold, you can't go back, and it changes people. It turns people into monsters. And I mean, similarly, if a population that doesn't zealously enforce the prohibition on human sacrifice, the implication is that people will begin quite literally worshiping these old gods of, that represent savage archetypes, and once you invite, I mean, this is a little bit metaphysical, but I believe there is a discrete consciousness to some of these entities. Okay, not in the way that you and I are talking right now, and not as if you can somehow contact them and speak to them like you would a corporeal being, but if, for example, you give them life within psychological environments, collectively, they become real, and they take on a consciousness unto themselves, and eventually they can act independently of, imaginary context. Okay, this is what explains the Wendigo phenomena, in my opinion. That's incredibly
This is the
dangerous.
idea of the egregore, something that is sort of spawned out of a collective consciousness. This is, I think, stupid sidebar. We'll get back to the point. The most interesting concept in both Warhammer 40K and also the old fantasy stuff, that the dark gods are manifestations of human evil over time, that they are egregores and eventually will become so powerful that the world will be subsumed by them.
Oh no, that's not stupid. I don't know much about Warhammer stuff. I played Twilight 2000 and Blood Bowl, but that's a Lovecraftian concept, which is and I mean a lot of the fantasy lore from stuff like Warhammer comes from like Lovecraftian stuff. And Lovecraft, he was drawing upon serious stuff. He was a learned guy, You know, like I said, James Maddow, who I think was a great man. I mean, admittedly, I'm kind of an eccentric, but you know, he incorporated Lovecraftian concepts into his, you know, into his view of pagan religiosity, because there's real substance there. It's not just silly stuff. But yeah,
Well, and to your point, right? If we're talking about consciousness, man is unique in that he is consciousness tied to a body.
yeah,
Obviously, we see bodies without consciousness all the time, right? Look at the animal world. Look at Twitter, for example. But as well, there's the idea of, you know, consciousness minus a body. Now, obviously, you know, there's God, there's divinity, which is, okay, that is a consciousness, surely, but something that's on obviously a much higher level. But when we hear scripture or other sources talk about spirits, right, something kind of in between, well, if you were a Christian of any stripe, that's something you ought to believe in. And if you take the proposition seriously that Satan and other spirits have power in this world, have the ability to make certain things happen, and if you look at the Jewish mystic tradition as where a culture goes after the rejection of logos, where they go after the rejection of the new covenant, well, clearly there is power to be had by, shall we say, searching for new masters.
well, yeah,
And one of the interesting things we hear from Jewish sources immediately after Christ is killed and the curtain is ripped is that the magic, so to speak, goes away. That you have priests talking about, you know, this kind of celestial light that used to accompany their sacrifices, and
right.
all of a sudden it stops. There's nothing in the Holy of Holies. And so if you assume that happens, the magic goes away. You assume the traditional succession of priests is put to an end. This is why, and not to get off on a sidebar issue, but Old Testament Judaism and rabbinical Judaism are fundamentally different things that are not connected at all. Really, they're completely separate. And to me, the idea that, you know, some sort of esoteric tradition that you see in the Cabala, which has these concepts of multiple gods, I'm maybe superstitious enough to not say their names, but you can certainly find them.
Oh yeah, no, I'm going to get into that in a minute, because, you know, like I said, I'm not a theologian, but I do spend time with comparative theology, and Israel Shack and Mircea Eliade got into that. And well, it's also too, I mean, the thing to understand here, and I know that especially other Bible prods, they're going to say, like, well, what do you mean? You know, like, the first 5 books of the Bible, you know, we follow the moral law of that, and we do. You know, like, how can you say that that's bad? Or that's not what we're saying. The Talmudic Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, it really emerges in 135 AD. Like, without a temple, without a celebrating priesthood, you don't have Judaism anymore. So you basically had a bunch of guys, many of whom were zealots. Like, you know, for those who don't know, zealots were men under arms who were resisting the Roman occupation. Judas Iscariot was a zealot, and he killed many men. That's one of the reasons why, you know, he was chosen to betray Christ, because his soul wasn't in jeopardy, because he was already damned, if you want to look at it like that. Okay, that's why Judas is an interesting character. That's the one issue I had with the film The Passion, is they don't present that correctly, in my opinion. But be as it may, you know, 135 AD, these zealots and these kinds of laymen in Judaism, guys who we probably view as experts on the tribal law, you know, jurists, they approached the Romans and said, yeah, can we basically set up, you know, like a rabbinic school, like a school of, Jewish theological heritage. And, by this point, I mean, the Romans literally burned the temple to the ground in 70 AD. They're like, do whatever you want. We don't care. They're like, these are defeated people. Like, whatever. If they want to, if they want to do if they want to build what amounts like a museum about what was 80 years ago, why do we care?
Wait, it'd be like if I don't know, the remaining Jim Jones followers wanted to put up a museum for him, right? It's like, okay, this thing is dead and gone.
Right. Who cares? And it's, so I mean, it's something totally different, and I think people don't realize that, or, I mean, that's a whole other ball of wax. Like the so-called Christian Zionists who aren't cynical. They're doing what they're doing out of ignorance, like genuine ignorance. I've heard them talk sometimes, and I think they honestly think that, a rabbi is just a Jewish priest, but he can get married or something. Like, they don't understand at all, like, what the lineage is. But yeah. Anyway, this is important to understand the subject matter. So the Judaism as we know it, these people really don't, to your point, like you said at the outset, these people don't really read the Torah. They're not, concerned with what we think of as Old Testament Judaism, even in a heritage capacity. And I'm not saying your average Jewish guy sitting around reading the Talmud, but if he takes his faith seriously, like the faith side of his ethnos seriously, the synagogue he goes to, his rabbi is basically, his source material is the Talmud. They're not sitting around reading the first 5 books of the Bible. Interestingly, there is a sect of the ultra-Orthodox, and that's their view of Hitler, is that, he's like Amalek, like the Pharaoh, like Haman. He basically is like God's vengeance because the Jewish people abandoned the Torah. And like, that's really interesting. I knew a guy years back. He was this Rogers Park Orthodox Jew. And like, I went to Loyola, which is in Rogers Park. And I started talking to this guy because I would get coffee at the same place. And like, he turned, I didn't know about that until he advised me of that. And so we'd discuss this subject matter. And like, I was like deep into Third Reich stuff. So we'd pick each other's brains about things. But yeah, he was very serious about it, which is interesting. But anyway, yeah, let me move on a bit with some foundational stuff. And like, forgive me if this is too scattershot, but I like I said, foundation is important. But
well, I mean, if it's too scattershot, I at least deserve some of the blame because he's typing up with whatever pops into my head at the moment. So
no, yeah, we're partners in crime. But and to your point too, among a large portions of the faithful, religious Jews today, that it's the Talmud supplemented by the Cabala, which is really accumulated writings focused on mysticism and all kinds of magic, in the arcane tradition. And this isn't some fringe thing, this constitutes the core of the faith, and at a basic level, this isn't conventionally monotheistic, in the way Christians and Muslims imagine it. And significantly, too, as I understand it, a lot of these deities that feature in the Kabbalah, they represent masculine and feminine archetypes, and they've got complex relationships owing to that polarity, and the properties of these entities, vary by sect, but, like what is emphasized and which aspects of the Talmud or Kabbalah are emphasized by any particular congregation. But this isn't, the traditional Jewish mantra of, God is one, or the Lord is one. there's not a monotheistic affirmation. It refers more to a union between these elements and literal deities in some cases. I mean, that's just one example. And even to your point also about the overemphasis on ritual, even Jews who have radically different ideas on, these, on the nature of the divine, they'll, what that doesn't really concern their fellows. What the big concern is abiding a common ritual, which really is the tribal law, and I mean, obviously, that's one of the things that Christ accused the Pharisees of. You hold out man's law as godly, and that's a grave evil, for reasons that shouldn't need to be elaborately explicated. So this is the kind of stuff where, again, incident to the Blood-Libel claim, when it admittedly some of these accusations are born of specious reasoning, but when, Lutherans especially and Orthodox vanguardists would say, the Ashkenazim are worshiping the devil, a lot of time that's what they were talking about, Satan being a stand-in. Because I mean, if you're a pious Christian, regardless of your confessional orientation, there's only one Satan. He has many faces, he has many guises, but there is only one. So coming across, some Cabala mystic rabbi who's admonishing his congregants to appeal to many gods and for all practical purposes, some of which have a masculine or feminine nature, some of whom are hermaphroditic even, that quite literally is devil worship, okay, in the eyes of the...
Well, and to that point, even if you take the most charitable interpretation, you say that, the Kabbalistic tree of life diagram, which, if you ever watched NGE, will be quite familiar to you. Well, all of those merely refer to different facets of the infinite, right? Different ways to view one unified God, which I don't think is a particularly convincing argument. But assuming that, even if you assume that, that's a very difficult cross-cultural argument to make in the context we're talking about. So even if you assume the best of possible intentions on both sides, you have to understand how very pious Christians would react negatively to seeing something like that, even aside from any kind of broader point about what actually was going on. It's an understandable human reaction.
Oh yeah, 100%. And that's something that's kind of lost in the discussion. I mean, obviously there's conceptual biases born of the propaganda environment or the psychological environment that's been curated by propaganda and discrete narratives. But yeah, it's not just some kind of shrill hyperbole or defamatory, accusation. That there's something there. And yeah, that's why, again, you mentioned Israel Shahak or Shahak. I can never pronounce these ethnic names correctly. I mean, he made the point, he was being kind of facetious to make a point, but not as much as people might think. Like he said, on an issue of what a Christian or a Muslim consider to be doctrine, Jews will disagree profoundly and kind of shrug it off. But then one man will be horrified to his fellow Jew washes his hands counterclockwise instead of clockwise 3 times a day. Or he mixes these dietary elements with one another, in the wrong way. It's a totally different orientation, and that's essential. And that's also people have speculated, including people who are actually quite critical of Zionism and what have you. They'll suggest things like, well, how could how could these kind of liberal secularist Jews who support things, like pornography and like homosexual liberation, how could they break bread with these, Orthodox guys or some of these, hardcore Zionists? It's like, it's because it's exactly what Shahak said. It's because they don't care about that. It's not, it's not like me or you coming across some crazy Methodist who is really into the homosexual agenda stuff. They look at it totally differently. And that also, there's an Oriental aspect to that, I believe. Like our friend Kevin McDonald, he was, talking about the kind of top-down tribalism of Jewish social groups and how that's really alien to an individualist Occidental mind, and he's right. But it's buttressed by this, totally what we view as, completely bizarre view of, the ceremonial or the ritual law being not just equivalent, but even superior to the moral law. And that's also key to understanding this, I believe, because that absolutely lends itself to a kind of moral particularism. And, like we were talking about, and I realize we got to wrap this up in a minute, but just briefly, concomitant with all these aspects and inextricably bound up with these aspects, there are flagrantly superstitious aspects to rabbinic Judaism, in the lives of religious Jews until very recently, and even today, particularly in, the Middle East or Eastern Europe, in places like Ukraine, this idea of magical objects or hexes or incantations having a real world effect on human affairs, or rabbis having this almost secondary role as sorcerers and being into numerology and thinking that they can divinate future events by interpreting numerical phenomenon. That's not unusual, and a lot of these practices that people would mistakenly only associate with, some Haitian guy who abides some sort of syncretic voodoo religion or some kind of animist religion you might find in sub-Saharan Africa or in Burma or something. This is very much an aspect of traditional Judaism, and you couple that with the truly totalitarian aspect of Jewish tribal life, like both you and Kevin McDonald raised, the people don't really question these things, even if I'm speculating, but even Jewish people might view that as silly or at odds with modern life. It's like, well, this is just the way things are, or this must be important because, Rabbi so-and-so says so, and he's basically, an infallible elder.
Well,
so it's kind of a
this.
Yeah, go ahead.
You see this in how especially liberal sources wrote about the plight of the Jews, that they viewed the Jewish peasantry as effectively subjects of great sympathy. They saw them, even from the outside, even from very Christian societies who did not have a sympathetic view of Judaism. They saw that insane totalitarianism. The punishment meted out towards Jews who broke their own internal law, which could be very, very minor things. We mentioned, for instance, speaking something other than Yiddish. Sometimes the punishments would be truly horrific. There are cases of Russian judges, just, to be honest, getting very, very annoyed at rabbis because they are trying to boil someone alive. And the Russians are like, no, we don't do that here. We're not savages. This is again within living memory of Ivan the Terrible. who admittedly is sort of another kind of figure of ritual hatred in the West. But point is, this is not, Switzerland in the year 1998. This is not exactly a particularly soft country. And even then, if the judges of the Tsar are saying, stop doing this to your own people, this is horrible, you have to have a certain amount of sympathy for those people. But to say, it needs to be understood that these people were incredibly insular, incredibly backwards by the standard of the day. And their religious leaders had a level of control over them that is impossible to understand, impossible to overstate even. These were incredibly insular communities. They spoke a language that almost no one who wasn't a member of that community spoke. They had very tight controls on information, what books could and could not be translated. And to that point, there are local Yiddish newspapers from Russia very, very shortly before the revolution. We're talking the 20th century, where you have newspapers with quite wide circulation disputing the existence of America because it's on the other side of a presumably flat world. And I don't say that to dunk on them, to say, oh, well, they're so stupid, but to say, like, you need to understand that we're talking about a very, very specific population and culture, and using your kind of existing Western priors, your analysis will fall short very quickly.
Well, and that's what's fascinating too. And we can wrap it up in a second, but reading between the lines, I found Henry Kissinger to be a fascinating guy because like my dad knew him, at Harvard, and I met the guy a few times. But he and Paul Gottfried, they're both descended from Jewish Berliners who were, and Karl Loeth was kind of one of these types too. But these guys, they were very uncomfortable with their Ashkenazim brethren from the Pale Settlement. They almost viewed it the way, some American Indian guy would view some kind of crazy drunk long hair guy who runs around shirtless and starts fights at the pool hall and still believes in wood spirits and things. And he like himself wears a suit to work every day and hangs around white folks and is kind of embarrassed about being viewed as a savage. I mean, that's an imperfect analogy, but this idea that, the Pale Settlement experience and the experience of Russian Jewry generally was like that of guys like Kissinger or Gottfried, or that they had similar behavior modalities. Like, don't get me wrong, like we could discuss for many hours the relationship of, the German Jewish elite to the majority in the East, but point being, people have a very skewed perspective of Ashkenazi ways and things and cultural mores. To your point, they view them as just kind of like American suburbanites who abide a peculiar religion or something. It's completely at odds with reality. But I promise. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, obviously we know what we're covering next. I'm really excited to get into that. This series has been very, very well received, and I'm excited to get back into it. If people want to find more of your work, not much has changed. Substack is still the best way to do that, but the links to buy your books will be there, as well as a link to your website and social media, as long as you have it.
Yeah.
You seem to be cursed on X, formerly known as Twitter.
Well, they just don't like me. I mean, that's not me being paranoid, or I don't have delusions that I'm important or anything, but it can't be denied. I do get singled out and for a certain sort of censorious antagonism. That can't be disputed. And I take it as kind of like a badge of honor because, frankly, I produce substantive stuff. I know that I do, because people plagiarize it and then don't credit me, and social media censors me. So but no, thank you for the plugs, man.
Sure thing. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. You want the episodes early and ad free, you'll have to throw me a few bucks. You can do so on Gumroad, Patreon, or Substack. Axios Remote Fitness Coaching, my sponsor. We've launched a new program take a survey, get 2 weeks of programming for free. No strings attached. Just want to see what you're interested in. Click the link, check that out. JD is extraordinarily patient with me and helps keep the lights on. Again, Thomas, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.